Hello, everyone. Wonderful to be here today with Dr. Carolyn White. She's going to be introducing herself, but she is the director at Undergraduate Studies in the program of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Harvard University. And we are just so fortunate to have her here today with us. Before we get started with the interview, Dr. Light, would you like to introduce yourself and your focus of research that is of interest to public health folks addressing health equity and social justice?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor. I actually am a historian. I'm a cultural historian. And the reason I put that out first and foremost is that that's not typically the academic training or disciplinary or methodological training that people in the public health space have usually. My areas of focus are United States transnationally, 19th and 20th century histories, with a focus on gender, ethnicity, and critical race theory, and a focus on what I am calling intersectional violence. And that means thinking about violence from a not just multidisciplinary, but thinking of all the different vectors of inequality that may weigh on a particular individual. And the reason this is relevant to public health issues is maybe pretty obvious, but of course, different individuals are differently situated in relation to power and in relation to different resources and access to, for instance, medical care when they're ill. So lately, my research has taken a turn towards the space of firearms and firearm violence and the United States' unique gun culture. And by unique gun culture, I mean that the United States stands far beyond economically comparable or politically comparable nations in the number of firearm-related deaths that we experience, the majority of which are self-inflicted firearm deaths. So I'll leave that there, but that sort of summarizes where my research interests are at this moment.
Well, I must say it's really fascinating. You come from a very different lens than a lot of folks who probably are at our conference today, and also who are in the public health arena. I was just wondering if you might share a little bit about how you came upon or what drew you to address gun violence and firearm use in the U.S. And basically, how did you come about in formulating the types of questions that you look at when you are doing your research? And perhaps do you work with other researchers, or did someone approach you about this?
That's a huge question.
Just something easy.
I'll do my best, and then you can prompt me if I'm leaving anything out.
Oh,
But
of course, of course.
The first question of how I ended up here, I mean, in a lot of ways, there are some happy accidents that happened along the way, meeting certain kinds of people whose work I find really inspiring and above all, essential and vital at this particular moment in our nation's history. But also some of it is autobiographical. I grew up in Southwestern Virginia. I grew up in a part of the country where guns are pretty ubiquitous. But at the time that I was growing up, guns were first and foremost used for hunting. Mm-hmm. So they didn't have the kind of political valence that guns have taken on so quickly in the contemporary 21st century United States. Mm-hmm. Also, I was really fascinated in my study of citizenship and belonging in the United States and my teaching related to immigration, related to histories of slavery and the afterlife, per Saidiya Hartman, of slavery, meaning the ongoing implications of slavery, even though the slavery as a practice that was outlawed in the 19th century is technically illegal. We see the reverberations of slavery in different kinds of exploitative labor practices, in mass incarceration, in sort of racial discrepancies in public health, and in who's actually most likely to be targeted by gun homicide and those kinds of things. So my historical interests and my personal life and upbringing brought me to focus my attention several years ago on the phenomenon known as stand your ground laws. And these are laws that originated in 2005 in Florida, as I'm sure folks are aware, but since 2005, they have spread to some over 30 states in various forms. And essentially what these laws do is remove the duty to retreat wherever a person can legally be, which means that when you feel, quote, reasonably, and I'm putting this in scare quotes very deliberately, fearful of someone, you're allowed to pull out your firearm, shoot first, ask questions later, wherever you may legally be. And as I'm fairly certain folks at least are semi-aware of, given the proliferation of civilian-owned firearms in the United States and this changing legal terrain, what we're seeing is a lot more homicides, gun-related homicides and deaths in the United States. But this has a very long history. And so my historical brain kicked in to ask, what are these stand your ground laws and what is their genealogy? Where did they come from? Why is it not just important, but I'd say essential to use an intersectional lens, meaning looking at the simultaneity of racial exclusions and white supremacy alongside gender exclusions and sexism and sexual violence, and also class exclusion and violence, to better understand why certain types of people are more likely to be targeted under stand your ground laws and self-defense legal terrain more generally. So in the process of producing that research, I wrote a book called Stand Your Ground, A History of America's Love Affair with Lethal Self-Defense. And that came out a few years ago. And after writing that book, I encountered all kinds of wonderful people working in public health, including at Harvard Chan School of Public Health, who are doing essential, vital epidemiological, criminological research on firearm violence with an eye towards trying to prevent it, trying to prevent firearm death. And this was really new for me, trained as a historian who does archival research. Suddenly I was being introduced to all these new methodologies that involve big data, like the CDC's massive accumulation of data in the National Violent Death Reporting System, the NVDRS. And yeah, it's intimidating and scary, but it also opened my eyes to a whole new world of possibility in terms of the kinds of things that can happen when you bring together so many disciplinary perspectives and methods to try to problem solve, to try to think of innovative ways to prevent death. And so I'm fully ensconced in that work now. I love it. It's the hardest thing I've ever done, but it's also, to me, the most hopeful space to be in, because I'm no longer alone in an archive, reading old legal texts and trying to decode them. I'm using my understanding of not just the past, but also how we use the past in the present, alongside people who have this experience in epidemiological, quantitative research methods. And it's really been eye-opening. It's been wonderful.
Well, that's just an incredible progression of where you come from personally and academically, and then how you also bridge gaps between what are considered often very different disciplines to create this very innovative approach to research, especially around a topic that is often considered quite hot button. And I must say, I did lob a question to you, which was multiple questions. You handled it beautifully and really provided a great deal of amazing information for our audience today. And I did allude here, your topic is, arguably one of the most contentious, especially in the United States around because of gun rights, gun violence, gun deaths, those both inflicted as well as self-inflicted. And I was just wondering, I didn't know if anyone had ever come to you personally or, through alternate channels to talk about that it might be too political, that it's too one-sided, that it might be too critical of gun violence or gun owners. And I just was wondering how you and your team responded to those types of questions.
Absolutely. I really appreciate the question. Yes. When I was writing about Southern Jewish benevolence, and that was my first book, I very rarely got called out for, kind of a radical or one-sided perspective. But now that I'm working in a more contemporary space around gun violence, I do frequently get accused of having a very one-sided or narrow viewpoint on the issues of gun violence. And when I think about that, I know that is inevitable. And I think about it from multiple perspectives. From the historian perspective, I think about the way in which our Second Amendment in this nation has been, twisted and misinterpreted and weaponized in a way that essentially distorts the original intent and language of the Second Amendment to be construed as there should be no restrictions, state, local, federal, on civilian firearm ownership. And I know, as a historian who has studied this at length, that the original constitutional meaning was not at all about that, especially at a time long before we had the kinds of technologies and gun production that we have today. So that's one side of it. And then the other part of it, I would say, is more epistemic and is more grounded in the data that I have access to today, thanks to my friends in the public health space. We as a nation are very much obsessed with this notion that guns are essential for our self-defense. And I believe that is it's happened over time. It didn't all happen at once, but I believe there's something very deliberate from the side of production, from the side of manufacturing, that when you produced a product that is no longer popular because of, for instance, waning interest in hunting, which really started around the 1980s. So this is in the late 20th century, people became less interested in hunting. Fewer people were hunting. And so fewer people wanted guns. And so what's the way to produce, what is the really sneaky and I think kind of brilliant way to produce desire for a commodity that is no longer of interest? Well, you convince the population that the only thing standing between themselves and a whole litany of nefarious bad guys or strangers is a firearm, a personal firearm. So it's around the late 20th century that you see the National Rifle Association take a hard turn to the right and become a reactionary, absolutist engine for unfettered gun rights. At the same time that you see manufacturers of firearms start to produce them specifically as objects of self-defense rather than as objects of recreation or hunting. And I believe this is what we're witnessing right now. And when you look at the numbers, when you look at the public health data, it shows beyond a reasonable doubt that firearms do not make us safer. In fact, having a firearm in your home makes you so much more likely of losing your own life or one of your loved ones' lives. So that for me has been quite an epiphany, because historians are trained to be storytellers. I'm good at telling anecdotes about people, individuals who are navigating the law and navigating their way to safety and security in the United States. What I wasn't trained to do was to put those stories alongside a larger scaffolding or a larger landscape of the data of actual firearm death and injury. and it's massive and it's only growing. And so that the reason I can say that as a historian, that has been like a reasonable trajectory for me, or one that has turned out in a way that now I see as totally common sense. It feels like a natural progression from thinking historically about all of these ideologies that we hold dear as Americans, how that transforms into this notion about firearms as essential to our self-defense, and how much of that was justified by an effort to try to mass produce an object that was in danger of becoming obsolete or less popular. And now we're at a moment where we really need additional research so that people are better aware, are better educated, that the best way to protect yourself is not to go out and buy a gun and have it in your house or in your car, but rather to avoid that and to pass more legislation that keeps guns out of our schools, that keeps guns out of our public spaces. So anyway, all of these things to me are essential. All of these approaches come together to help launch an intervention in what I think has become a really toxic and misleading set of assumptions about firearms in the US today.
Yes, that's you raised so many issues, and my mind is just swimming when you were discussing earlier, basically guns being part and parcel to kind of unaddressed or unrectified, notions in our past around, stolen land and stolen labor, how that is all intertwined, and I think it really speaks to why guns are more popular in the US South as opposed to the North. And also these stand your ground laws are much more populous, if you will, in states that are more associated with the history of slavery in this country. And I didn't know if I had that wrong, or if that's part and parcel of like some, misguided assumptions.
Well, I don't think it's misguided. I think on some level you really are right. I'm not sure about one problem with the data that we have is that we technically in our nation don't track who has firearms. We just don't. And that's by design. That's part of the gun rights lobby, is to obfuscate the data of who actually has guns and how many guns they have. And that's part of the problem here, is that the Second Amendment gets interpreted as a right not only to have as many guns as you want, but also to not have any kind of federal or state oversight over or tracking over who has guns. So I can't say for certain, I can't speak for certain to the number of guns, but I will say that there are states in New England that have very few or very light, if any, restrictions on firearm accumulation. So right now we're looking at a nation where the notion of constitutional carry, very deliberately called constitutional carry, in honor of the Second Amendment, I guess, which is translated into permitless carry, meaning that you don't have to have any kind of gun safety training, any knowledge of how to use a gun. You just have to be of a certain age and be a, quote, law-abiding citizen in order to accumulate firearms in some states. And so a few of our neighboring states, including, I would say New Hampshire and Vermont, have very lenient firearm restrictions, if any. So we live in an area in New England where increasingly civilian firearm ownership is proliferating, and including in some pockets in our very own state. And I anticipate this actually changing given the recent Supreme Court Bruin decision, which overturned a New York state regulation around civilian firearm ownership in a way that brings under scrutiny state regulation of firearm ownership. So we really actually we're at a pivotal moment right now where I think even in a state like Massachusetts, which not only do we have pretty strict regulations on civilian firearm ownership, but if you look at our public health data, comparatively speaking, we're among the states that it's on the lowest side for firearm related death and injury. So I expect that to change as the legal terrain shifts to accommodate this interpretation of the Second Amendment that says that states and the federal government and localities do not have a right to restrict a law-abiding citizen's right to have and bear firearms.
Well, that is certainly fascinating and
terrifying.
It's terrifying. It speaks to so many things, like, I carry assumptions about, the differences between North and South in the US, but obviously I wasn't even thinking there are plenty of guns in like Vermont and the like, where places are more rural, just because folks have had hunting weapons and now it's slightly different. But all of this raises like one final question, just thinking about all the things that you discussed today, is basically ultimately what impact do you hope your research has? Because a lot of times, folks publish papers and it goes into a wonderful high impact journal and that's where it stays. But the work you're doing is so important. It doesn't sound like we can afford as a country to have that happen.
That's such a great question. Thank you, Circe. From the get-go, when I started writing about stand your ground laws, and I remain really fascinated with stand your ground laws. In fact, I was naive enough to think that our nation would have an awakening after Trayvon Martin was shot and killed in 2012, and his killer went free, was exonerating in court, was acquitted. After Jordan Davis was killed the same year, also a 17-year-old African-American teen. And Renisha McBride, I believe she was 19 when she was shot and killed also in a stand your ground state. I thought that with this rising body count and with our nation's recognition around the continuity of white supremacist violence, I thought that these stand your ground laws would start to disappear, would be overturned, or maybe would be mitigated. And I was wrong. The opposite happened. They've actually spread. So what I would like to see for my research is that first of all, that I continue to collaborate across disciplines. I've been trying to build connections, for instance, with journalists, because I actually think journalists have a lot of power to get stories out to a wide variety of people. And these stories are really powerful. So the stories of the people whose lives are lost or who lose loved ones are very important to recognizing the actual impact of the weaponization of self-defense in our nation, and the way that and the spread of guns is making our public spaces not safe for any of us, really. So my hope is that maybe this research reaches more people so that they can better understand the impact that these kinds of shifts may have on them and their loved ones. Because if there's one thing I've learned through my deep dive into the firearm violence research through public health, is that it's closer than you think. It's always closer than you think. There are only a few degrees of separation, if that, between yourself and somebody you care about who's harmed or who loses their life to gun violence. And I worry it's only going to get worse in the coming few years. So yeah, my hope is that I can get this research out in whatever form possible through multiple collaborations across the disciplines, And that's also the space I really like to work in. I love collaborative research. It's hard, like I said, but it's also so incredibly illuminating. I feel like I'm learning something new every day.
Well, I just find the work you're doing like so important,
Thank you.
and changing and really creating like synergy across disciplines, and addressing such an important issue in such a thoughtful way. And it's really, a matter of life and death. And that's what we deal with in public health. And you really provide such a primer, if you will, on how to talk about difficult issues that really do trigger folks in a very productive fashion. So I can't thank you enough, Dr. Light, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you everyone for listening. It's been really great to speak to these questions.
Yes, thank you. And I just want to tell everyone, Dr. Light is one of our columnists at HBHR Journal. So please go to hbhr.org and read her wonderful articles that are there right under the tab where it says columnists. And thank you again, Dr. Light. And we look forward to hearing from you again and reading your future work. So
thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
bye.